Hey guys, what's up? Today we're bringing you 3 new budget decks for the latest expansion from Legends of Runeterra, the Rising Tides. We defined budget as being any deck that has 3 champions and 3 epics and no more than that, and not costing over 18,000 shards. As a reference, a completely common deck would cost only 4,000 shards.
Yeah, so it's actually cheaper than most people are probably expecting when they hear 18,000 shards. That can be a bit intimidating. After we go through each of these budget decks, we're also going to show you guys what it's going to take for you to upgrade the budget deck into the non-budget, more competitive version of the same deck. We think it's a waste of your resources, essentially, to spend a whole bunch of them crafting this deck if it's not going to be able to turn into something competitive, and it's not going to be able to build into a fairly, competitive deck. So we're going to give you guys some of those expensive cards that you can add in over time or once you collect them, so you can turn the deck into its most competitive form.
We also wanted to show off decks from multiple different regions, and more importantly, multiple different playstyles, being an aggro or a mid-range or a control, since everyone enjoys different kinds of decks. In the description, we'll have links for each of the decks and all their upgrades, and we'll posting a video with detailed gameplay and strategy for each of the decks.
Yeah, so if you guys enjoy this video, or even if it just helped you pick out a new budget deck for the expansion, leave a like for our content and subscribe to us, as our channel is kind of just getting started and we'd love all the help we can get. So why don't we take a look at some decks first here. What is our first deck for today?
The first deck we're going to be looking at is probably the strongest of the 3 we have, and is easiest to learn as it's the mid-range deck. This is the Bannerman Scouts deck, and the one we're showing you today is from the regions Demacia and Bilgewater. This deck takes some elements from the strongest deck of the last expansion and combines it with a powerful new scout mechanic.
And one of the things we're going to be doing on our channel is whenever we use a phrase or whenever we talk about a game term, we want to help newer players especially be able to track with what we're saying. For us, we hate it when you're coming into a game new and fresh and maybe you've never even played card games before and you don't know what we're talking about. So we're going to always try to give at least a chance when we can to teach what some of the language is, what some of the terms are, teach deck building tips as we go along. We're always going to try to help define what we mean too. So for this, we've got things like mid-range or scout.
Scout, for example, is the new mechanic that allows scouts, or the card with a scout descriptor, to attack once before your other followers. Scout is very strong in this deck specifically because there are many cards that can benefit from multiple combats in a single turn.
This deck is also what we would define as a mid-range deck. Lots of different card games actually use the term mid-range, but a lot of people actually don't know what the term means, or they contradict or disagree on what it means. So when we use the term mid-range, we just mean that you take the strongest cards that are available to you at each mana cost. So you take your best 1 cards, 2 cost cards, 3 cost cards, and as long as they fit in with the strategy you're trying to do, all you're trying to do is play the biggest, most powerful thing you can each turn.
So in this deck, it would look like you're playing something like Synthri on turn 1, War Chefs on turn 2, the Badger Bear on turn 3, and so on all the way up to cards like the new 6-mana card, Citrus Courier. When you curve out like this, the deck feels very unstoppable, and it's very clear to see why.
Yeah. And when we use the term curving out, we're talking about the mana curve of a deck. So if you look at this mana curve here, it's of the deck we're talking about right now. But if you compare it to this deck here, like we're showing on the screen, you can see that this curve is much more focused on the cheaper cards, whereas this deck, the one that we're on right now, has a lot of options at each point in the mana curve. When you hit that turn 1 play into turn 2 play, into turn 3 play, into turn 4 play, and so on, that is when you're really curving out, like the term means, and that's really the strength of the mid-range deck. But also can be its shortcoming. If you're drawing those cards in the wrong order, that's where the deck starts to fall apart.
This is also why this deck is so easy for new players to learn. Often the best play is simply just to spend as much mana as you have each turn, every single turn.
Yeah, one thing to note about this deck too is the version of it, I guess, that we're showing here has 3 copies of Misfortune and no copies of Quinn. There are ways you can play this deck with all copies of Quinn and no copies of Misfortune as well, because the final build would require 3 of each. Now, if you're a free-to-play player, I think the best way to do it is to replace each copy of Misfortune with something that's a challenger 3-cost card, such as Laurent Protege, or even Fiora if you have her. And as far as Quinn goes, replacing each Quinn that you don't have with a Razor Scale Hunter is a great alternative. Again, one thing you want to be careful of when you're doing replacements with this deck is not to get rid of too many of the Demacia cards for Bilgewater cards, because then you reduce the chance of triggering Allegiance on your Bannerman card.
Now let's move on to the fully upgraded version of the deck. The big things you want to focus on obtaining are the powerful champion cards that really elevate this deck to one of the best we've played. Since both Misfortune and Quinn benefit from the new scout mechanic and multiple attacks on each turn, these are the big upgrades you're going to want to make as soon as you can.
Yeah, definitely. As soon as you get those 3 Misfortunes and the 3 Quinn in the deck, you'll really feel the power level increase. But yeah, let's move on to our next deck here. This is an interesting take on kind of what was the classic Noxus Aggro playstyle. The Aggro playstyle prioritizes playing fast and killing your opponents before they can assemble their own strategy. So like we saw with the last deck, the mid-range deck is focused on playing the best thing each turn. This deck is more focused about playing lots of things every turn. And what's nice about aggro decks is if you're just trying to climb the ladder, you win games quick, and you also lose game quicks, which kind of just makes for fast ladder climbing if that's a priority for you. And it obviously is a lot better than having some of those 45 or 30-minute long games.
What's interesting about this version of the deck is that you sacrifice some of the usual aggro cards you would see and replace it with more spells, cards which grant Overwhelm, and the brand new Horns of the Dragon card from the Ionia region.
And even though you miss out on some of the raw kind of aggro power of the traditional Noxus aggro deck, you add in this explosive combo finishing potential when you combine the double attack from the Horns of the Dragon and any card that gives it Overwhelm. If someone uses a small follower like a spider, which are really common, to block your Horns of the Dragon, this is something that we would call a chump block because the spider is a chump and he's saving your life by blocking. So if somebody chump blocks your Horns of the Dragon and only blocks 1 damage of it, comboing this Overwhelm with the Horns of the Dragon will deal 13 damage when used with Might, for example. And that can be done as early as turn 6 with the 6 mana cost of the Horns of the Dragon, plus saving 3 spell mana to use Might on him.
Since this deck is already such a low-cost deck, there isn't really any champions that you necessarily want to sub out.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's really nice about this is when you go from the base deck to what we're calling the upgraded deck, it's actually only 2 cards, I think, different. You're just adding those Shirazas, and for those players that I think actually Shiraza is included in those kind of welcoming bundles as well, which is awesome because that gets you part of the way to this final version of the deck. What's nice about adding Shiraza is you add another card that doubles the effect of any buff card played on it. So that's really why we're adding those cards to the deck.
Yeah, so moving on to the next deck, which is a really interesting new deck that came out with this expansion, which is a Maokai Mill deck. This one is a control-heavy focused deck in which the whole game plan revolves around Maokai and his ability to remove your entire opponent's deck except for 4 remaining cards.
The basic gist for this strategy is you're going to want to try to get rid of as many cards in your deck in order to trigger the Maokai, as well as killing as many of your own units in the process. Because again, hitting that 25 mark to level up your Maokai does take a long time. But the nice thing is once you do that, you've got this awesome combo finish that kills most decks on the spot, where you play Maokai, deal some damage to your opponent, and then steal 4 of the remaining cards all in the same turn so they die the next turn.
Yes, when the combo actually goes through, it seems very, very unstoppable, and it's a very, very powerful deck in many situations. Unlike the aggro deck that we previously just talked about, though, unfortunately this deck can take quite a long time to play, and usually with controls decks, it can take much longer to master and get all the combos correctly worked out for.
For some of you guys who are longtime card game players, if you're coming from a Magic the Gathering background or a Hearthstone background, you may actually really understand and maybe even love these sort of control decks. And the challenge of learning the new deck might not be as big of an off-putting facet for you. So maybe this is something you're looking for, is that fatigue style control deck. And if that is, then that's certainly something you might love about this style of deck. Another nice thing too is even in play testing this deck, I found that I'd be winning some games against aggro decks just by outvaluing them. I wouldn't even get to that Maokai win condition before I'd run them out of steam and they'd concede against me, which is a pretty satisfying feeling for some players.
For this deck, obviously it is mandatory that you have at least 2 Maokai in it. Otherwise you would be without your finishing combo and ultimately no way to win the game. Having Twisted Fate is a good addition that will help you maintain your lead while forcing your opponent to waste precious resources for fear of losing the game because of it. Once you have the base deck built, you should slowly work towards having 3 Twisted Fate and 3 Maokai in order to give you the most competitive advantage. So this covers all 3 of our budget decks that include cards from the latest expansion, the Rising Tides. We encourage you to give all 3 of them a shot and comment what your thoughts are on these decks and what you would do to improve them. Thanks for watching our video and give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to see our future videos covering the in-depth guides for each of these decks.